Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I have a whole bunch of questions here for us to go through today. But first, just a reminder that Forgotten Weapons is largely made possible thanks to the fine folks on Patreon who contribute to make the show continue. So everybody on Patreon from $1 a month up gets a feed of Forgotten Weapons videos completely ad-free delivered to their email. So if you're tired of YouTube unsubscribing you at random or just not recommending videos to you, perhaps consider checking out Patreon. Sign up $1 a month or more. Some of the pledge levels have some pretty cool perks, and every video I do gets sent directly to your email and your Patreon feed. They don't have an algorithm, so they don't automatically block that or decide not to show it to you. Anyway, the $2 pledge level and up are the folks who are eligible to submit questions for the Q&A. So if you'd like your question in next month's Q&A, consider that. Anyway, let's get down to business here. Our first question comes from Fruitbat44. And he says, as the treacherous Elbonian Minister of Defense, you returned from your latest jaunt around Paris to find that your deputy, a true Elbonian patriot, has equipped the armed forces with a pretty decent service pistol. So the questions are, 1, what would you consider to be a pretty decent service pistol? And 2, as the treacherous Minister of Defense, how are you going to sabotage the pistol training program? All right, so a reasonably decent service pistol for a military, in my mind, is pretty, it has to be inexpensive, simple, and reliable. That's really all you need. There isn't really an accuracy requirement. I don't think there's really a harsh environment durability sort of requirement. These are sidearms. They are far more used for, they're not frontline combat weapons. They tend to be the sorts of things that military police carry, that soldiers carry as a backup to their true proper weapon. They're going to be carried in nicely enclosed holsters, or at least they should be. They're going to be reasonably well protected while they're not being used. And so, to my mind, it's a pretty simple thing that I think a lot of militaries overthink. Now, you can get too cheap, and I think that's what happened with the P320, the M7 and M8 pistols for the US. You get too cheap, the manufacturer has to start doing things that can be a hindrance to the reliability of the pistol. To my mind, you're best off taking something that has a widespread commercial production and a good track record. And to me, the HK VP9 would be a great service pistol. Any of the Glocks are good service pistols. The Ruger RXM would probably make a perfectly fine service pistol. Beretta doesn't yet make a service, well, they do. Beretta's got a cool service pistol coming. CZ has some good polymer framed service pistols that would be totally perfectly adequate, do everything that you need. I would also go so far as to suggest that something like the SIG P365 could actually make a surprisingly decent service pistol. We've kind of gotten into the mindset today of a service pistol has to be a big, full-sized gun. And it feels like from the outside, I'm not in the military, I'm not involved in military procurement, but from here on the outside, it feels like everyone's been watching a whole lot of special forces movies where the hero will inevitably at some point run his rifle dry, sling the rifle, and dramatically transition to a big full-size service pistol and proceed to take on half a battalion of bad guys with a pistol. And that doesn't really actually happen that much in real life. It does occasionally happen, but even with special forces operators, the times when you have a rifle and pistol and you actually use the pistol are pretty skimpy. And we used to, decades and decades ago, there was a concept of a service pistol. Like, one of the benefits of a service pistol is that it was compact, it was light, it was handy, it was out of the way. And it didn't really impede the carrier doing much of anything else. And so you'll get service pistols like the Beretta 1934 and 35, which by all accounts were quite popular and quite effective. And to me, P365 as a more compact option isn't necessarily a bad idea, nor would other pistols that are reasonably inexpensive, simple, and reliable in that sort of size scale. So, now, second part of the question, how would I sabotage a pistol training program? If I could come up with some way to make the ammunition more powerful, like increase recoil, the two things you would want are to either get just the right balance of heavy recoil and not enough training to ensure that you develop a flinch with all of your trainees. If that's not possible, the best way to sabotage a pistol training program is just to have as little of it as possible. Perhaps make things as irregular as possible. Alternate, if you have a DA-SA pistol, alternate between training drills that are double action and training drills that are single action to try and prevent anyone from actually getting enough repetitions to get used to and get proficient with either trigger mode. It's kind of the easiest, honestly, the easiest way to sabotage a military pistol training program is to just call it a cost-cutting measure and stop having it. Replace it, you could replace it with rifle training and just kind of BS the concept that we're doing rifle training and those skills all carry over to pistols, so we don't need separate special pistol training, and the time and money from that would be better spent on doing something else. None of these are perfect solutions. Some of those skills do, in fact, transition from rifle shooting to pistol, but that's the best I can come up with off the top of my head here. Next question is from John. It says, what's the most contrarian view on firearms that you hold? I'm not really sure. I don't really care for engraved firearms. I know a lot of people share that, but there are also a lot of people who think a precious metal, heavily engraved firearm is the absolute peak of gun perfection, and I just really don't care. I understand, I recognize the skill that goes into really good engraving, but it just doesn't hold any appeal to me. I can respect the skill of the engravers and not, that's not my thing. That's not what I'm going to spend money on trying to get. That's probably it. In some circles, the idea that 5.56 is a perfectly adequate cartridge and we don't need to transition to a 6.5 or a 6.8 or that's also perhaps contrarian. We have one more Elbonia question that we'll knock out right here at the beginning, and that is from David, who says, the Elbonian Minister of Defense has come to you to ask for your recommendations for a submachine gun for the Elbonian Gendarmerie. What do I give them? And the best answer I can come up with that is a Chris Vectors. We're going to give the entire Elbonian Gendarmerie Chris Vectors because, and in fact, we'll give them 45 ACP Chris Vectors, because in my experience, the purported recoil absorbing, climb reducing features of the Chris Vector do not really hold up. There's maybe a little bit of it in a 2-round burst, but that's kind of it. So let's give them 45 ACP, maximize the recoil from the gun, and also make sure that it's a semi-auto, full auto safe selector, or even better, I don't think Chris doesn't actually make a full auto only version, but if we could special order a full auto only 45 ACP Chris Vector, that would be about the most perfidious submachine gun I can come up with that would also be justifiable or arguable in today's society. Of course, there's really old stuff, but the point of Elbonia is what is something that sounds good but is actually really not good. And the Chris Vector to me is kind of the epitome of that in a submachine gun. The Restorationist says, I restore old military aircraft and have long wondered if there's any real difference mechanically between the M2 and the ANM2 besides the solenoid trigger. He goes on about some of the differences, but hasn't really seen any. So the ANM2 runs at a slightly higher rate of fire. It is more intended as an aircraft gun. It does this basically by having a shorter and lighter barrel and having a barrel booster on it. So the booster is going to increase back pressure to push the barrel and bolt assembly rearward faster when you fire. That's going to increase the rate of fire. And then by having a lighter barrel, you've got less mass that has to be accelerated, accelerated and then decelerated and then accelerated back forward. And so your cyclic process happens faster. I did see a number of references to the ANM2 having a lighter weight bolt than the M2HB, but I can't actually nail down conclusively that it does. In my day, even working as I do with Forgotten Weapons, I don't have that much direct access to aircraft guns most of the time. I don't have hardly any experience with an ANM2, so perhaps someone who does work with them can enlighten us down in the comments. Is there actually a difference between a standard M2HB bolt and an ANM2 bolt? people say there is, but the evidence I can find suggests that they're actually the exact same thing. Now, the one that is definitely different is the M3. That is the much higher rate of fire gun. The ANM2 will do about 800 rounds a minute compared to the about 500 to 600 rounds a minute of a regular M2HB. When you get to the M3 is when you're hitting like 1,000 or 1,200 rounds a minute. So it's substantially sped up, and that definitely has some other lightened components. But yeah, as far as I can tell, ANM2 is your booster and your barrel. Stephen says, in your opinion, what impact, if any, would the G11 have had if it was actually adopted? It's commonly said the G11 was on the verge of being adopted, but the Cold War ending changed financial priorities of Germany, which it did. Say the Cold War continues for a couple more years, the G11 starts getting fielded. Are other countries going to take a serious look at caseless ammo? Does Germany keep it around, or does it turn into something like the EM2, where it's like bureaucratically adopted and then unadopted before it ever goes into production? I think we don't really have any way to know, because it depends on those last couple of years of final development. Yes, the G11 was sort of in the pipeline and in real consideration, but it wasn't ready for mass production. There was still work that had to be done on it in a lot of the small level details, and how effective that work would have been is really what would determine if the gun was long-term successful as a service rifle or not. So things like, are they able to perfect a cartridge binding material that will fire, that will not cause squibs, that won't leave debris in the barrel, but is also strong enough to resist cracking or breaking from rough handling when it's in magazines or loose. You know, if the rounds have this tendency to crack and break, that causes malfunctions. That's the sort of thing that can prevent a gun from getting through a final set of legit field trials to actually being adopted. Same thing goes for the reliability of the system. That thing is a freaking Swiss clockwork nightmare inside, but maybe it was actually well enough enclosed and protected, and maybe you could have the parts well enough engineered that they weren't going to be breaking on any sort of regular basis. And in theory, you could have a gun like that could be reasonably effective as a field service rifle. On the other hand, maybe those challenges would never be able to be overcome, and you end up with a gun that's hopelessly unreliable in actual field conditions. The real G11 never quite got to that final stage of development where we would get the answers to those questions. Now, from my perspective, just looking at the last stage of development of the G11, I think the Bundeswehr would have been kind of nuts to actually adopt it. To me, it's just the complexity of it should be a big, gigantic red flag that this isn't where we should be going. Then again, I said the same sort of thing about NGSW, and I was completely wrong about that. So who knows? Maybe. I don't know. But yeah, the final state of the G11 in reality doesn't give us the information necessary to make a conclusion about whether the actual production G11 would have been workable or not. Speaking of NGSW, Ryan says, where do you see the NGSW program going? Now that every component has significant problems, no other service, besides the US Army, is interested. The Special Forces community is going its own way with the HICAR. I have no idea. Like, I'm done trying to make predictions on when NGSW is going to die, because it hasn't made any sense to me from the very beginning of the program. It managed to go this far. Who knows? I don't have any direct insight into the upper echelons of procurement and Army logistics that are deciding to keep this thing in service. Like, as far as I can see it, the sooner it is finally shut down, the better. Like, the less we spend trying to integrate this thing into combat service, the better off we'll be when it finally does go away and we have to transition back to something else. I don't know. We have another comment about HICAR coming later, so I'll hold off on that for the moment. Ryan says, oops. Some Michigan guy says, why are 30-round Sturmgewehr magazines significantly longer than 30-round AK magazines? The outer case dimensions are nearly identical, so it must be something else. Well, sort of. So first off, the outer case dimensions of 8 Kurtz and 7.62 by 39 are not quite identical. There is a 0.6 millimeter difference in diameter between the two. And that sounds really, really tiny. And it is pretty tiny. However, when you multiply that out by 30 rounds, you end up with 18 millimeters, which is just about 3/4 of an inch. Now, granted, that would be 30 rounds in a straight line. These are staggered, so you get a little bit less of that, practically speaking. But the bigger difference between these two magazines is actually the taper of the case. So if I go ahead and actually measure the back spine of both an AK and a Sturmgewehr magazine, what you find is that, double check my numbers here, yes, the AK magazine is 9¼ inches, the Sturmgewehr magazine is 10 inches. 3/4 of an inch difference, which is almost exactly the difference in case diameters of 30 rounds actually stacked out. Now, realize they are staggered. However, as the stack gets longer, the magazine spring becomes more of an issue. A longer spring is going to take up more space at the bottom of the magazine once it's fully compressed. At any rate, the actual difference in length between these two magazines isn't that great, but the AK magazine is much more curved, which means not all of this length is actually going straight down the gun. Some of it's going out forward, and that's what contributes to it. I think as well, the Sturmgewehr is kind of a taller gun, and while the magazine's not really at any different position relative to the barrel, the pistol grip is dropped lower down on the gun, and I think that contributes to the Sturmgewehr just kind of feeling like a taller gun beyond what you actually get with the two magazines. So if we line these up, like that's your difference. There is a pretty substantial difference at the bottom end of the magazines thanks to that curve. David says, if you could only have one submachine gun, what would it be based on any criteria? Anything at all, I would probably go for an M2 Hyde submachine gun. They're pretty cool. They're pretty good to shoot. They're pretty controllable. They're very rare. They're neat. That's kind of like checks all the boxes for me. Unfortunately, they're also basically unicorns. They're unavailable. There are probably a couple of them on the registry. As best I know, I think 6 survive today. I don't anticipate I will ever have an M2 submachine gun. Cool as it is, I am not willing to, even if I had the money, pay the money to, like, I'm not going to put that much money into that particular gun. Because frankly, they're so rare, originals are, that I don't know that I'd really be willing to take it out and shoot it a lot for fear of breaking it in some irreparable way. And if I'm going to have my favorite submachine gun, like, I want to be able to shoot it. So my runner-up is actually one that I have, and that's a Suomi. In this particular case, that's a Swedish M3739 Suomi, which is, there's some pros and cons between that and the Finnish KP31. This is shorter, handier. You know, the barrel's only 2/3 the length. I love the high rate of fire, the large magazine capacity. It's a remarkably controllable submachine gun, and it's just a whole lot of fun. It's super reliable. It's handy. It'd be kind of cool if it had a pistol grip, but overall, that covers almost everything. Like, I tried to think about what submachine gun, if I could sell that as a transferable, and it's not actually a transferable, but if I could sell that for transferable prices and use the money to buy any other submachine gun, would I? Like, what would I replace it with? And the answer I come up with is, I don't think I'd sell it, because I don't think there's anything out there that's realistic that I'd actually want to replace it with. Archer has a rather long question here. Says, with the growing interest in sub and supersonic calibers like 300 Blackout, 8.6 Blackout, or 338 ARC, the idea of cartridges where there is both a subsonic heavy bullet and a supersonic light bullet option, it seems that an auto-regulating system like that of the Farquhar Hill could be an ideal solution to deal with the variance in operating pressure of subsonic versus supersonic ammunition. I can see why this might not be relevant for special operations that will tailor-make solutions or use only one type of ammo, but it seems an obvious solution to dealing with the civilian rifle that will inevitably have spectrums of both ammo loadings. Why have no modern civilian rifle manufacturers made use of this feature? So the Farquhar Hill had this kind of interesting system. It was like a 2-part gas piston where when you fired, the front end of the gas piston would compress on a spring until it got to a certain point, and when it hit that point, it would trip a release that would release the back half of the piston, which would then push on the bolt assembly. So the idea was, if you had super low pressure ammunition and the piston took more time to actually come back to compress the operating spring enough to work, it had that time. And if you had higher pressure ammunition that moved the piston faster, it would, well, naturally, whenever the piston got to that point, it would then fire instead of having an open gas port in the barrel and just taking, instead of working like a typical rifle. Honestly, something like that, I think, might be a valid option for this exact use case, where you do have a significant spectrum of different pressures, much more so than just poorly spec'd ammunition. There's a wide spectrum of operating pressures in 7.62x39 as well, but not nearly as wide as something that's deliberately being made with a 220 grain subsonic and also a 110 grain supersonic. Like, that's a huge variation. The best I can come up with as to why no one's done it before is, frankly, that sort of system is very expensive and it's going to require a lot of engineering work and a lot of testing. And on the military side, most of the adopters of systems like this are going to have one specific subsonic and one specific supersonic cartridge that they're using, assuming that they are using both and not just picking one of the two. And I think it's still viable for a designer to get a rifle that will operate just okay at both of those extremes, as long as they know exactly what the two cartridges are that they have to work with. On the civilian side is where you get this like just random mishmash of ammunition. But I think for the civilian side production, you don't have the budget to develop a rifle. Like, there isn't enough demand to justify the budget to develop a rifle that can effectively fire. I mean, really what we're getting at is we're going to spend a ton of money to make an expensive rifle so that it can shoot the worst quality ammunition. And that's sort of a mismatch, a customer mismatch of the person who's going to go spend the $5,000 on the first one of those sorts of rifles that anyone is willing to put in the effort and cost to design and build correctly. That person is not at the same time going to be feeding their rifle steel-cased Wolf supersonic subs and like whatever the cheapest 300 blackout they can find at both ends of the spectrum is. The person who's got that kind of budget for the rifle is far more likely to be something like one of the military users that has their very specific ammunition already spec'd out so that the manufacturer knows exactly what to build for. I could be wrong on that. Be interesting to hear from anyone who's got design experience with this sort of conundrum. Like, are there elements that I'm not thinking of here? Why an adaptive recoil system like that might not be viable, aside from just being complex in general? Let me know down in the comments. That'd be cool to hear from someone. Dave says, it is 1908. There's a Christmas party underway at the 13-story Continental building in Los Angeles. Armed German anarchists burst in, herd everyone together, and go about cracking a secure vault filled with currency and gold bullion. There's no SWAT team, no FBI, no helicopters or armored cars coming to the rescue. The German anarchists are well prepared and bring numerous state-of-the-art weapons to handle any eventuality. So, what does 1908 Hans Gruber bring to what is definitely not the Nakatomi Tower? And to my mind, there's not that much. I don't think 1908 German diehard villains would have shotguns. So Dave suggests like handguns, shotguns, rifles, whatever. I don't think they'd really use shotguns. It was sort of an Old West thing, kind of, but it was much more of a forced into this role because it's the one gun that you have out on the frontier, and wasn't really seen as a. I don't really see them bringing handguns or bringing shotguns. Instead, what I see are largely handguns, and that would be. This is going to sound basic, but it's going to be Lugers and C96s. I can definitely see C96s with shoulder stocks as sort of a pseudo carbine. It's a good gun in 1908. There's not a ton out there to compete with it. The Luger certainly can. The Luger is adopted just a couple years earlier by the German military. The Luger's been around since 1900 for the Swiss military. There are commercial sales. They're readily available. And it is one of the best self-loading handguns on the market in 1908. There's some other stuff, like Colt 1903s are nice, but less powerful. I can see these guys with Lugers and or stocked C96s. For a rifle, perhaps a couple Winchester 1907s. You can go to Wikipedia or Google and find a whole list of pre-World War I semi-auto rifles. However, the reality is virtually all of them were prototypes, military experiments, and or hopelessly unreliable, like not ready for prime time designs. These guys aren't bringing Mondragons, which is not like Mondragon is 1908. That's not cut in the time frame either. They wouldn't have had time to actually get them. But none of these guns are really quite fit for actual service. And from the sound of Hans Gruber's not bringing a wonky experimental gun. He's going to bring the best thing available that he knows is going to be reliable and dependable. So I could see Winchester self-loaders, 1905 or 1907, as a potential. The Remington Model 8 is still, to my mind, if it's introduced in 1908, this happens in 1908, it's probably not viable. It doesn't have time to actually find out if the gun is good enough, is reliable, and get any practice in with it before taking over the Nakatomi Tower. The big thing that I see them doing is bringing in a couple of Maxim guns. And these would serve the exact same role as the missile launchers, the rocket launchers, that Hans Gruber had in Die Hard. When you see that, the police armored car is coming and they rush to set up a little rocket, fairly large rocket launcher to shoot out the window. Instead of that, Hans Gruber would have an early world standard Maxim gun. There were commercial Maxim guns available. By 1908, they were being adopted by military powers. They were known to be good, reliable guns. They were absolutely high-tech, state-of-the-art, massively powerful weaponry. And Hans Gruber would totally have two of those things on a tripod, or probably not a German Army sled mount, probably tripods. The tripod's going to give much better articulation off the roof of the building or out one of the windows of the building. He'd totally have Maxim guns. And that'd be the coolest part of that movie. Let's see. Rip Burger says, is there any historical evidence that the SKS was used by communist forces during the Korean War? That is an excellent question, and I figured rather than try to answer it myself, I would turn it over to Comrade Clower on Type 56, The Story of China's Army. Jason Clower, very generously offered to record an answer for us, so let's ask him.
The short answer is, to my knowledge, no. There's no publicly known case of the SKS being used that is securely documented. Even though it's hard to prove a negative, it's been 70 plus years now. And if the SKS really had made a secret appearance in the Korean War, even in small numbers, we would expect to find certain traces of it by now. For the Chinese forces, it's clear to me they did not have SKSs. China didn't start making its own copy of the SKS until 1956, well after the armistice. And during the war, of course, the Chinese did use all kinds of crazy weapons. They had Mauser pattern rifles. They had lots of leftover Japanese Arisakas. They entered the war with some Lee Enfields. They captured everything in the American inventory and formed very definite preferences about which ones they liked and didn't like. And during the middle of the war, they got substantial shipments of Soviet Mosin patterns. So they had all kinds of crazy stuff. But after all this time, we still don't have a Chinese military document showing that they even had contact or knowledge of an SKS out there. Nor do we have documented battlefield photographs of an SKS there, nor do we have an American report about an SKS being captured. In the North Korean case, it's harder to be quite so confident because North Korea doesn't answer my calls. But theoretically, it's conceivable that the Soviet Union could have supplied the North Korean People's Army with a few SKSs, and somehow the Chinese didn't know about it? Okay, it's possible in the philosophical sense that we don't have affirmative proof that it didn't happen, but we have so much circumstantial evidence pointing the other way that it's really hard to swallow. There's a pair of CIA reports from 1955 originating from information from Soviet forces stationed in occupied Austria, and they portray the humble SKS as being still an unusually sensitive secret for the Soviet garrison there. Both the rifles and their ammunition were subjected to elaborate secrecy protocols. When the Soviet troops would take their SKSs to the range, one man would shoot and another man would catch the brass out of the air with either a butterfly net or his hat, so that not even a telltale cartridge case would be left behind to maybe be delivered to the American spies, who would discover that there was this new Soviet rifle. Furthermore, the men were warned that if they lost so much as a cartridge case, they would face 20 years in the brig. That's how secret the Soviets were keeping the SKS, all the way in 1955. And reportedly, even then, the CIA had only one specimen of a 7.62 by 39 millimeter cartridge in the entire world. And again, this was 1955, well after the Korean armistice. Well, what about the Chinese? What did they know? There's a story out of China about exactly the same period. A General Zhao Erlu, who was responsible for China's arms procurement, visited Moscow to buy small arms for China, and the Soviets were keeping the existence of the SKS secret even from him. And he only learned about it by accident when he walked through a door in the Tula arsenal and discovered dudes making this cool semi-automatic carbine there. Now, maybe that story is apocryphal. I don't know. But it is a lot more plausible if you take it together with the CIA reporting out of Austria that year. Both accounts have the Soviets guarding the secret of the SKS's existence as late as 1955. And if even China didn't know anything about the SKS until 1955, that's a big problem for my what-if scenario, where maybe, just maybe, the Soviets gave a small number of SKSs to the North Koreans to try out during the Korean War. Because we would have to believe that the Soviets entrusted their secret weapon to the North Koreans, of all people, and that the Koreans did not lose a single copy, and also that their Chinese allies never saw a single glimpse of this unknown, super cool Soviet weapon and reported it up the chain, such that years later, the top man in Chinese arms procurement would finally see an SKS and be thunderstruck by it. And note that for the Chinese to learn about the SKS in Korea, it wouldn't have had to be widespread. One SKS spotted by a Chinese officer, that would have been enough. An unknown Russian infantry wonder weapon in North Korean hands, or any hands, word of that should have rocketed up to Beijing. And by now, we would know about it. And the ammunition is an even bigger problem. Suppose that Stalin really did say, sure, send a limited number of SKSs to my honored ally Kim Il-sung, because I, Stalin, have unlimited faith in the fortunes of North Korean arms. We will supply them with just a small number for hand-picked formations, and we will see to it that not a single SKS falls into enemy hands, not even a single gas tube, or bolt carrier, or top cover, or weird-looking magazine. Not one of these distinctive parts shall fall into the hands of our enemies or our Chinese allies. And suppose all of this was done according to the word of Stalin, and no SKS or part thereof was ever lost in battle, or photographed in the hands of a communist soldier on parade or in battle, and that the SKS was successfully kept a mystery, both to the Chinese and to American military intelligence. Suppose that all of that happened. Are we also to believe that on the battlefield, all the SKS riflemen also retained all of their distinctive stripper clips and caught all of their flying brass and pocketed it? Because even those little oddities should have attracted the attention of the American Ordnance Intelligence System or the PLA's intel officers, because they would signal the existence of an unknown Soviet weapon system. So to conclude, were there SKSs in the Korean War? None that we know of. Might there have been some that we still don't know about? Occam's razor still says no. And in fact, even Occam's Nerf lightsaber for ages 5 and up still says no. I wish there were, because I would love to write that book. But sadly, there weren't. From the Type 56 Ordnance Bureau, this is Jason Clower. Back to you, Comrade Ianov.
Thank you, Comrade Clower. if you guys are interested in learning more about the Chinese military and their tactics and their weapons, their organization, absolutely check out Jason's YouTube channel, Type 56, The Story of China's Army. I'll have a link in the description text below. Fantastic work. Yeah, we've got some stuff coming with Jason that I'm excited about. But next up, we have Colin, who says, H&K famously jumped straight to the MP5, which was originally the HK54, as their big submachine gun success in the 1960s, with no MP1 through MP4 in their lineup. Was there ever an earlier prototype, etc., etc.? The answer is MP5 is not an HK designation, it is a German military designation, and there were, in fact, MP1 through MP4. MP1 was the designation for the Beretta Model 38 submachine guns, MP2 was the Uzi, MP3 was the MPL from Walther, and MP4 was the MPK, also from Walther. You then have MP5, which is the H&K submachine gun, MP7, also the HK submachine gun, and just for good measure, the MP6, as best I understand it, was actually going to be, like, it's a predecessor to the MP7 when it was the small caliber kinetic component of the one of the configurations of the early OICW. The OICW was a combination of an explosive firearm and a kinetic firearm. Two guns, one-shot bullets, one-shot grenades, and they're kind of lumped together. And the concept was you could actually detach the bullet firing part, which in the regular OICW, that kind of became the G36, sort of, kind of. It was a short-barreled 5.56. But there was also an iteration of it that was like a 4.6 millimeter, like an MP7, and in its original detached form, that was going to be MP6. It, of course, never got farther than, I mean, OICW never actually happened, and so when they eventually developed that into a standalone PDW, it becomes MP7. All right, David, I think a different David, but I didn't keep track of it, says, any news on FAMAS clones or kits? They are progressing. So I periodically talk to Childers about their work on their semi-auto FAMAS receivers and building out some of those few number of FAMAS valorisé kits that came into the country. They are getting there. Things, it takes time. There's a lot of work involved, but it is progressing. It's not stalled out, and I very much look forward to when I get my kit back as a built semi-auto. When I do, you can absolutely rest assured that I will be posting some video of it because it's going to be incredibly cool. As for other guns, other parts kit news, I don't have any. At this point, the way I'm seeing import stuff go, I would bet that we're going to get at least some small batches of FAMAS F1 parts kits. I haven't seen them yet. I have no idea what country they would come from. I don't think the French would actually sell off any of those, but then again, they did sell off the FAMAS, the Feline or Valorisé kits. I don't know. Theoretically, they could come from France. Theoretically, they could also come from another of other countries that France has sent FAMAS rifles to over the years as military support, assistance, aid, whatever. So I suspect it's going to be happening, but I have nothing direct to pin that on. Freedom Delivery says, various next-generation infantry weapons programs from the late Cold War experimented with revolutionary ammo types like duplex, Flechettes, and sabots, caseless ammo, etc., and didn't go anywhere. Do you see potential for any of these being the next game-changing innovation? I think, so caseless I don't see happening. I think there are a lot of fundamental issues with caseless, especially regarding heat management, malfunction clearance, and while it seems like a really good idea on paper, there's just a lot of kind of boring sorts of issues that have to be overcome, and it just never quite works out in favor of caseless. As far as different projectile types, something like a sabot or a duplex or even triplex round, those, by the way, are when you have 2 or 3 separate individual bullets in one actual cartridge. So you load one round, you pull the trigger once, it fires once, but 3 separate projectiles come out. I think those have a very practical utility. The problem is the military isn't just about combat effectiveness. There's lots of other stuff. There's marksmanship training. And I think that one of the fundamental problems of multi-projectile ammo is it becomes really awkwardly hard to do marksmanship training because people just, they want to be able to have a bullseye and how, like, I'm going to measure my marksmanship by how close I get to the center of the bullseye. And you can't do that with multiple projectile ammunition. The whole concept is you want some spread to it because you are basing its effectiveness on sort of the random variation and error in actual combat shooting. And I think that makes sense, but like, I hate to say it, like, it sounds cliche, like the generals will never accept it because they're all raised on proper single shot marksmanship. The Marine Corps, every man is a rifleman. Well, you're effectively arming the Marine Corps full of riflemen with shotguns. And they're just mental blocks to being able to do that. And everyone's always going to bring up situations where I need to make one precise shot and I can't have multiple projectiles flying around in random places. So I think they have value. I think in a practical sense, they definitely do. There are certainly some downsides. They tend to be very lightweight bullets. If you have duplex or triplex, each bullet is typically half or a third the weight of what a single projectile would be. So you get less penetration, less terminal effectiveness, but better chance to hit. I think those are trade-offs that can be worthwhile, but I'm not optimistic that anyone's ever going to push through the mental obstacles and bureaucratic obstacles to actually adopt something like that. Aurelien says, the Enfield pattern 1914 was supposed to replace the Lee Enfield, the SMLE. The 1917 Enfield, the same rifle in 30-06, was numerically the most important rifle of the American Expeditionary Force in Europe in World War I. Both are regarded as excellent. So why did the UK and the US Armed Forces keep the SMLEs and the 1903 Springfields after the First World War? And the answer to that is basically institutional logistics. Yes, when World War I ended, we had more 1917s than we did 1903s, but all of our infrastructure was built around the 1903. The armorers were trained for it. The infantry training manuals were all written for it. The parts supply was in place for it. And from the Army's perspective, the 1917 really wasn't a better rifle. It was just an alternative rifle that did the same thing, and incidentally did not have target sights that were as good as the 1903 Springfield. Like, that's not an insignificant part of a decision like this. When you do, like getting back to our last question, when you do have a bunch of high echelon important people who value target marksmanship, well, they're going to be biased towards the rifle that has the better target competition style of sights, potentially. So, yeah, essentially we had everything in place to use the 1903. The 1917 was a stand-in, it was a substitute. It was a perfectly adequate substitute, but it didn't necessarily do anything better than the old rifle, and we've got all the accessories, we've got all the infrastructure around the old rifle, so we're just going to keep the old rifle as the standard after the war when we need a lot fewer rifles anyway. Retired No Bad Days says, what do you think is preventing the 6mm ARC round as a standard for future military use? Money. I think it's expensive to change over. Standardization is also very important. So the reason nobody's going to change from 5.56 to 6 ARC is because that's a tremendous amount of money for a relatively small increase in performance. 5.56 is a really good cartridge. I mentioned this at the top. Maybe this is one of my controversial views, but 5.56 is a great cartridge. We don't need to try and get something that's 3% more effective at the expense of replacing the entire 5.56 ecosystem. Then the other option is, well, what about countries that are adopting a new rifle? What about Project Greyburn? You know, the British are going to change over everything. Well, first off, even if they're replacing all the rifles, keeping 5.56 as the cartridge means we have a ton of ammunition and ammunition supply and magazines and all sorts of other stuff that we can just continue to use instead of having to scrap it all and buy new stuff. But then secondly, we want to have standardization. The Western Allied powers, NATO, have standardization, and it's important and is there for a reason. And the cartridge that has the potential to be a replacement for 5.56 in NATO is not 6 ARC, it's 6.5x43, because that is the cartridge that is actually going through the process of NATO standardization. The Canadians are very interested in it. The British might be. I don't know details there, but I could certainly see the British being interested in it. And once that cartridge has an actual NATO standardization, it's going to be STANAG 4884, I believe. Then your standardization argument goes away. And if you are going to a brand new rifle, then some of the overhead questions, the replacement equipment questions go away as well. And maybe there's a potential there. But it's not going to be 6 arc. If it's anything, it's going to be 5.56 or 6.5 by 43. In theory, like in Bizarro world, it could be 6.8 by 51, except fortunately so far, no other military appears to be foolish enough to actually adopt that. So like that could be, but I don't think that's going to happen. I hope that doesn't happen. John says, why was John Guerin seemingly obsessed with making a primer-actuated operating system for a service rifle? It's like he pursued it until the Army arsenal system started specifying crimped primers. Briefly resurrected for the spew, what's so attractive about primer-activated operating systems? The deal, I think, is they're not super complicated, they're very lightweight, and the operating pieces are all at the back end of the gun. So a normal gas piston, you have to tap gas off the barrel. You're adding weight to the front of the gun. You're adding moving parts to the front of the gun. You're bolting stuff onto the barrel, which is going to impact accuracy. That's part of the reason the M16 is a remarkably accurate firearm in its original gas impingement design, is because while you're tapping gas off the barrel, you don't have any moving parts out over the barrel. You have less stuff disrupting where the barrel is actually pointing when it's firing. Gas pistons do, and that's a problem. Well, if you have a primer-actuated system, you get all the benefits of delayed blowback, but it also remains a relatively clean system. It's fully locked, which gives you a little more control over how the gun's cycling. Primer-activated makes a lot of sense as long as the ammunition is capable of working with it. So, of course, the big thing for the US military was if you don't have staked primers, you do potentially run into issues of primers coming out in machine gun ammunition. And what you really don't want to deal with logistically is having 2 versions of the exact same cartridge, one for the machine guns and one for the rifles. And if you put the machine gun one in the rifle, it just doesn't work because it's staked and the rifle has to be primer actuated. But then if you put the unstaked rifle ammo in the machine gun, the primers might fall out under recoil. Like, oh man, there's an Elbonian solution for you right there. Let's set up that. So I totally understand why the Army nixed that idea, but it's a cool system with some real benefits. It's light, it's simple, it's accurate. Just impractical because of the ammo. Manuel says, as a non-American, I'm wondering about your firearms laws. Here in Spain, the firearm laws are quite ratchet-like. They're always getting more restrictive and they never go back. My question is it the same in the US, or does the government sometimes make concessions? I know it depends on the particular state, and there's some laws that expire, but like as a general rule. Our firearm laws in the US do actually swing back and forth. They do get worse, and then they do actually get better, although people tend not to remember the bits that get better, because it's easier to remember the bits that you're upset about. I get it, that's just basic psychology. The assault weapons ban, referenced here as one of the laws that did expire, but to me that's absolutely an example of a law that was passed and then there was not the political will to pass it again 10 years later in 2004, and so it just expired. We have things like the 1986 Firearms Owners Protection Act, which everybody remembers for the Hughes Amendment to it that closed the machine gun registry. That law actually did a lot of really good things for firearms owners in the US. It dramatically improved your ability to travel interstate with firearms. It made it possible to mail order ammunition in a way that had not been possible before. I think the Hughes Amendment was intended to kill the entire bill, and the only reason that they wanted to do that was because the bill actually did provide a lot of benefits to gun owners. So yes, our gun laws do improve. We're actually seeing a lot of changes in real time right now on firearms importation regulations. Again, just showing that yes, they do occasionally get better. Concealed carry legislation has dramatically improved over the last couple of decades. in virtually all states. There are some that are still really bad, but there have been a lot of states that really liberalized their concealed carry laws, and not that many states that have made concealed carry harder to do. So yes, we are fortunate. We may not appreciate it all the time. It may get lost in the shuffle of elements of gun laws that get worse, but we are fortunate that they do actually come back and forth, and things do get better sometimes. Let's see, I think I skipped one here. Imperator 314 says, what features do you look for in a gun safe? What do you recommend for typical gun owners? All right, I'm going to be a little snobby here because this advice isn't probably going to be all that relevant for a lot of people, but if you are a substantial collector of firearms, my attitude is I hate gun safes. I abhor gun safes because if you have any sort of reasonably large gun safe to hold part of a collection, the moment something's relegated to the back shelf of that, like the back row of that gun safe, it's never going to come out again. It's never going to see the light of day. It's just too much of a pain to dig through everything else in the safe to get to it. And to some extent, like, you might as well not even own it anymore. So my recommendation to collectors would very strongly be to consider coming up with a way to have a secured room. If it can be, these can be rooms with metal door frames, metal doors, secured windows. They can be rooms in basements. Like at high ends, really high-end gun collectors have like serious bank vault style doors built into basements where they store a collection. That's like the top 1% sort of thing. But if you can have a secured room to store your firearms, then you can actually display them. You can actually have access to them. And it's just so much better than having 15 guns jammed into a gun safe or 30 guns jammed into a gun safe. Like, the bigger the gun safe, the less chance you'll ever see the stuff that gets driven into the back of it. All right, Cody says, have you ever been asked, or would you ever lend your expertise to testify in Congress for gun rights? Do you have any desire to lend your voice to the politics surrounding gun laws in the United States? So, first half of this, I've never been asked to do any sort of congressional testimony. If I was asked, would I? Yeah, absolutely. To me, that's part of civic responsibility. If you have expertise in an area and it becomes relevant to national legislation and the government wants your input as an expert, I think, yeah, unless there's some really good reason not to, you should contribute your expertise to make the laws in the country better. Congress is made up of professional politicians who almost by definition can't be particularly well informed on the vast majority of things that they may be asked to legislate about, and they have to depend on subject matter experts. And if you are one of those subject matter experts, like, what better recognition of your expertise than actually be consulted to make legislation or policy? It's never happened to me. In theory, it could. As a historical firearms person, it seems there seem like pretty limited opportunities where it might become relevant to Congress. As far as lending my voice to the politics surrounding gun laws in the U.S., my attitude is that the best thing I can do is to educate people to the best extent possible. If I were to try and become a political activist specifically, it would mean I just wouldn't have time to do what I am currently doing on Forgotten Weapons, and I think I can provide more by doing what I'm doing now than by becoming a political activist. All right, we have two more. Mark says, why are bullets jacketed? In your hilarious 1883 Reichsrevolver bug match, the black powder cartridge still has an unjacketed solid lead bullet, but I don't recall ever hearing or seeing about unjacketed bullets in modern guns. Is it due to the pressures in smokeless powder? No, but sort of. It's due to the rotational velocity of the bullet. If you take a 2,800 foot per second muzzle velocity and you have a 1 in 10 twist barrel, you are getting a rotational velocity of a gajillion RPM, and it's enough that lead can't withstand it, and just an unjacketed lead bullet will spin itself apart. Like, you'll fire, you'll get recoil, nothing will hit the target, because your bullet will turn into a dust somewhere downrange. And that's why they originally started putting lead jackets on. So early firearms, pre-smokeless powder, you typically didn't jacket the bullet. Lead was soft, which is nice because it doesn't wear on barrels very much. And and you didn't need it. It expands really nicely when it hits a person, and it's cheap. Boom, done, easy. Once we get serious muzzle velocities, which are the byproduct of having smokeless powder, all of a sudden lead is not structurally sufficient to form a bullet by itself. Instead, you start coating it with copper. Copper is soft enough that it can engrave in rifling without damaging barrels, but it's strong enough that it'll hold the bullet together at modern rifle twists and velocities. So solid lead bullets are still used a bit. They're still used a lot by people who are shooting black powder stuff. If you're shooting a muzzle loader, you kind of have to use solid lead because trying to muzzle load a jacketed bullet is going to require way more force. Like, you're not just pushing a copper jacketed bullet down a muzzle loader barrel with a ramrod. Lead is nice and soft and you can do it. Copper will do it under pressure from being fired, but not with a hand ramrod. You do also see plain lead bullets being used by hand loaders. People who make their own ammo and they want to do so at minimum cost. Well, you can save a penny or two or a couple cents on bullets by not having a copper jacket on them. And there you go. That's typically where you'll see it. Competition shooters. Some USPSA, IPSC style of shooters will do it. You'll see it with bullseye shooters as well. Yeah, it's out there, but you won't find it in rifles, smokeless powder rifles. And our last question is from Iron Akela, who says, from the coverage I've seen, SOCOM's HICAR program seems like it could be the next evolution in military firearms simply because they're looking for an upper to fit an M4 capable of firing an 82,000 PSI round. Does the HICAR have the potential to kill NGSW, and if not, why not? Other countries and the Marine Corps haven't shown any interest in NGSW or its cartridge. Could the HICAR appeal more? It might. I didn't think the NGSW was going to appeal more, and here it is, as I already said once in this video. HICAR is going to have some definite downsides. It's going to lead to much higher barrel wear, much higher component wear, similar to what we saw with M855A1. It does mean replacing the upper half of all the rifles that use it. I can absolutely see it for SOCOM. For SOCOM, this is an opportunity to say we have the technology to have this super high pressure, high velocity ammunition. We can take, and remember, the purpose of the really high pressure in the 6.8x51 was not just to get velocity, it was to get velocity from a short barrel. They wanted a short overall length of rifle with a suppressor on every gun that led to them having a limit of a 13-inch barrel to make an overall length limit. How do you get 3,500 or 3,300 or whatever the official number is for the real go-to-war ammo? How do you get that velocity out of a 13-inch barrel? The only answer is ridiculously high pressure. So SOCOM, I can very much see having some similar desires in terms of barrel length. They want a very short, handy rifle. They want to put suppressors on all of them. Okay, now how do we get the terminal performance of a 20-inch M16, but do it with an 8-inch barrel or a 12-inch barrel or whatever they end up going with? Well, hey, 10 years ago, this 82,000 PSI wasn't viable, but now maybe it is. Let's make a non-bimetal case. Let's do just a solid stainless steel case. And if we have a low barrel life, that's just fine because we're SOCOM and we have a lot of money per soldier. We're not trying to equip a 100,000 man reserve force. We have a couple hundred operators that are going to get these rifles. And if they burn through twice as many rifles in a 5-year period, big deal. That's not a significant amount of our budget, or it is, and we're willing to spend it because we get outsized results from those guys having super duper fancy ammo. So is the Army going to adopt some HICAR program? I doubt it, but again, I didn't think NGSW was going to happen, so I'm probably not the person to look to for predictions on this one. We don't know for sure that anyone can actually do HICAR. You know, HICAR is out there, they've got proposals, but as far as I know, nothing's actually been delivered and tested yet. So it may very well be another program where the Army wants some super magic bean and industry is simply unable to actually deliver it, and so it all goes away. You know, that's what I thought NGSW would be. Turns out they didn't have the magic bean, but they delivered it anyway, and now we're all in trouble. Well, not all of us. Now the Army's in trouble with M7 and M8 rifles. Anyway, that is everything I've got for this month's Q&A. A big thanks once again to everyone on Patreon who helps support Forgotten Weapons. Remember, if you're sick of not seeing, if you're not seeing the 3 or 4 videos a week that I am posting on YouTube, it might be because YouTube has simply decided not to show them to you anymore. If you subscribe over on Patreon at any dollar value, you will get every video delivered to you by email and in Patreon's app. Patreon's app, by the way, is actually a pretty cool, effective one. They've been putting a lot of work into it just in the fairly recent past, making it better, adding some cool extras, and making sure that it's a way for you to actually follow all of your favorite creators. So I know a number of the folks from our, sadly, not ultimately successful History of Weapons and War program are over there on Patreon. You can follow them as well as me if you're interested. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.